Well, another day today. I feel good. How about you?
Amen.
Praise the Lord. This will be session number 17, believe it or not. 24 hours in less than a week. It's, kind of an arduous task, both for you and for me, because you have to answer the lessons. But I think it's been productive. I think it's been a blessing. And so today we are going to study lesson number 29, The Reward of Grace, part 2. Part 1 we kind of touched on when we talked about the rich young ruler. So I'm skipping that one. We have an entire lesson on the rich young ruler, but we touched upon that in a previous lesson. So we're going to do part 2, which is the parable of the workers of the vineyard, those that came at different hours of the day. Before we study, though, we want to begin the day by having a word of prayer to ask the Lord to be with us. Father in heaven, thank you for the good night's rest that you have given to us. Thank you for allowing us to see the light of a new day. We ask that you will bless us this day. It's going to be very intensive, very active, and we want your presence to be with us at each instance in our study today. So be with us and guide us as we study this parable of the workers of the vineyard. Help us to learn the lessons that will be valuable in our personal walk with Jesus. And thank you for hearing our prayer, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. In this lesson, we will study the parable of the workers who went out to labor in the vineyard at different times of the day. In our study, we shall find that in the original application of the parable, the owner of the vineyard represents God. The vineyard represents the world. The early workers represent Israel. And the 11th hour workers represent the Gentiles. So it has a local application to the Jewish nation, or else Jesus would not have told these parables to them. Obviously, they apply first of all to them. We shall also find that the final application of the parable contains a solemn message for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, for our church. Now, I want to read this parable as we start because it's very, very long and has lots of details. Some of the other parables are short, but this parable is a long parable. It's in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. So I'm going to take the time to read the parable. You can follow along in your Bibles or in the syllabus. It's there on the first page of this lesson. For the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is a householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, that would be a denarius, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour. The first time that he went out was 6 a.m. approximately. The third hour would be 9 a.m. in their way of reckoning time. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said to them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Again he went out about the 6th and 9th hours, and did likewise. That would be 12 noon and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. About the 11th hour, 5 p.m., he went out and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all the day idle? They say unto him, Because no man hath hired us. He says unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that shall ye receive. So when even was come, that is probably 6 p.m., because the 11th hour workers worked 1 hour. When even was come, the Lord of the vineyard saith unto his steward, Call the laborers, and give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first. So it's important, from the last to the first. And when they came, that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny, or a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed that they should have received more. And they likewise received every man a penny. And when they had received it, they murmured against the good man of the house, saying, These last have wrought but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden and heat of the day. However, he answered one of them and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst not thou agree with me for a penny? Take that is thine, and go thy way. I will give unto this last even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? So the last shall be first, and the first last. For many be called, but few chosen. So that's the parable. You'll notice it has lots of detail. And so that's why I've taken the time to read it. Now we want to study the lessons that God would have us learn from this parable. So let's go to the setting of the parable and the central truth that Jesus wanted to teach or to transmit in this parable. Number one, did Jesus take a real life situation to illustrate the reward of grace? Absolutely, like he did in his other parables. It was the custom for men seeking employment to wait in the marketplaces, and thither the employers went to find servants. I had an interesting experience that's similar to this. I lived in Torrington, Wyoming, in the southeastern region of the state, in the Rocky Mountain Conference. And, there they have lots of plantations of wheat. And I remember that downtown there was a certain area in the town where early in the morning you would have all of these individuals, most of them from Mexico, waiting in line for the owners of the plantations for them to go and work in their fields. So something similar to that is what we find when Jesus told this parable. They were very well acquainted with this. Jesus didn't simply invent stories. Jesus took their real life situations, nature that they could observe, and he used these things to teach them spiritual truth. Number two, what central truths does this parable contain? It is only through the unmerited grace of Christ that any man can find entrance into the city of God. You're not going to work your way into the city of God. The parable illustrates the manner in which God deals with his servants and the spirit in which he desires them to labor for him. So this parable teaches something about God, and it teaches something about those who labor for God. And those are the central truths of this particular lesson. Number three, what do the landowner and the hired laborers represent? Well, Ellen White explains in Christ's Object Lessons, page 396, thus householders dealing with the workers in his vineyard, represents God's dealing with the human family. So who is represented by the landowner? God. Who is represented by the hired laborers? The human family. That's in general. We're going to notice that more specifically, the first laborers are the Jewish nation that is called to serve God first. Now let's talk a little bit about the remuneration, because this is a strange way of remunerating people that you find in this parable. So let's go to number one. Did the owner of the vineyard agree to pay the 11th hour workers the same amount as those who worked longer? No. Let's notice, this is interesting. Now, when he had agreed with the laborers, that is of the first 3 shifts, for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. He said to them, you also go into the vineyard. And now this is the following groups. He said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right you will receive. Interesting little detail, but an important detail. So the first ones he says, I'll pay you a denarius. The ones that came after, he says, I'll pay you what's right. Would you go and work at a company if the boss said, I'll pay you what's right? I don't know. If I work for God, yes. But if I work for some company, I don't think so. You know, when we've employed people here, justly, they've always asked us, how much am I going to make? And so this is strange that the workers that came afterwards, they didn't say, well, how much is that? How much is what is right? No, they had a good spirit. They said, we'll go and work, and we trust the owner of the land. He's going to give us what's just. Interesting. Let's read the note. The owner of the vineyard agreed to pay the earlier hour workers 1 denarius, but he did not make the same promise to the 11th hour workers. He promised to pay them whatever is right. Now, notice the following quotation. In the parable, the first laborers agreed to work for a stipulated sum, and they received the amount specified, nothing more. So, did they receive what they were expecting? Of course. So why should they complain about what other people make? You know, the biggest sign of a Pharisee is that the Pharisee wants to be remunerated for what he does. In other words, his reason for working for the Lord is mercenary. He works for a reward. And if others get a bigger reward, he criticizes them. So those are the two characteristics of a Pharisee. And of course, this parable is being directed, surprise, surprise, at the Pharisees, as so many of the other parables. So in the parable, the first laborers agreed to work for a stipulated sum, and they received the amount specified, nothing more. Those later hired believed in the master's promise. Whatever is right, that shall ye receive. They showed their confidence in him by asking no question in regard to wages. They said, we'll work and we'll leave the payment to the owner of the land, and we trust him. We know that he's going to give us what's right. They trusted to his justice and equity. They were rewarded, not according to the amount of their labor, but according to the generosity of his purpose. Isn't that a magnificent teaching when it comes to spiritual things, to salvation? Aren't you thankful that God does not reward us according to how much work we do? Number 2, in what sense does God's method of compensation differ from that used by men? See, God's system of compensation is totally different than the compensation that you earn from the company you work at. Let's notice. In worldly business, compensation is given according to the work accomplished. The laborer expects to be paid only that which he earns. So you can't use what happens with a business to apply the way the Lord remunerates. But in this parable, Christ was illustrating the principles of his kingdom, a kingdom not of this world. So the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of the world are radically different when it comes to remuneration. She continues, they, that is the laborers of the vineyard, were rewarded not according to the amount of their labor, but according to the generosity of his purpose. Let me ask you, when you work at a company, at the end of the week, the owner of the company comes and says, oh, here, I'm going to give you a little gift, and pays you. What would you say? What do you mean gift? Here, I'll be generous with you. Here, I'll pay you, and he pays you what you worked for. Well, that's not generosity. Generosity is when somebody gives you something more, right? So God, according to this, pays us according to his generosity, not according to the amount of work that we do. We're going to see it's according to the spirit with which we work. The motivation that leads us to work is the basis of God's payment. In fact, number 1, on page 209, what is the basis for our final reward? His reward is given not according to our merit, because work, if you work, you merit pay, right? You're earning the pay. But his reward is not given according to merit, but according to his own purpose. Not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy, he saved us. Here's a thought question. How can we reconcile Paul's statement in Titus 3 verse 5, which is the one that we just quoted, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us? How can we reconcile that statement that God gives us salvation not according to our righteousness, but according to the mercy of God, with several statements that we find in other places of the Bible where we are told that when Jesus comes, we are going to be rewarded according to our works? How do we reconcile that? We say, God doesn't pay you according to your work. But then we have these texts that say that when Jesus comes, he will reward everyone according to their works. There appears to be a contradiction in the Bible. But there is no contradiction. It's only an appearance of a contradiction. The way we reconcile this is that in the judgment, God is going to reveal the motivation that led us to work. In other words, works are the fruit of our relationship with Christ. They are not the way in which we earn a relationship with Christ. Paul and James are a perfect example. Martin Luther did not like the Epistle of James. In fact, Martin Luther did not write a commentary on 2 books of the Bible. He wrote on every book of the Bible except for James and Revelation. He said, Revelation, I don't find Christ in that book. He says, all I find is beasts, and all I find is horns, and all I find is mysterious numbers. He says, I can't find Christ there. Don't be too hard on him. He was living a long time ago. And the book of Daniel had not been unsealed. That takes place after 1798. Martin Luther had troubles with James because James appeared to contradict Paul. Because Paul said that man is justified by faith without works of law. And then here comes James and he says, was not our father Abraham justified by works? Was not Rahab justified by works? And so a person who is questioning the inspiration of the Bible would say, see, the Bible contradicts itself. But the Bible doesn't. You see, Paul is explaining how we're saved. James is explaining how a saved person lives. Are you with me? In other words, Paul is speaking of the root of salvation. James is speaking of the fruit of salvation. And if there is no fruit, there's a problem with the root. So you're justified by grace through faith, but it's not a bare faith, it's a faith that works. And if it doesn't work, it's not faith. We just have to make sure we don't put the cart before the horse. To put the cart before the horse would be, I work and God pays. No. I give myself to Christ and then works flow. Naturally. You don't have to tell an avocado tree, produce avocados. Because its nature is to produce avocados. And so if I have a relationship with Christ, Christ doesn't have to say, hey, produce fruit. No, the fruit will come. Are you understanding the distinction between the two? And by the way, it's interesting, I have a whole presentation on the relationship between Paul and James, but the Apostle Paul uses the example of Abraham when God called him to come out of Ur of the Chaldees. He believed God and it was accredited to him for righteousness. It says in Genesis chapter 12. But the example that is given by James is when Abraham was willing to take Isaac and sacrifice Isaac on the altar. Did that show that Abraham had faith? You better believe it did. Abraham was not saying, I'll sacrifice my son and you save me. No, he had already been justified by faith. But now he proves that he was justified by faith in being willing to give up his only begotten Son, as he's called in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. So there is no contradiction here between a reward coming from the generosity and mercy of the landowner and the works that we perform. In fact, these workers in the vineyard that came afterwards, when they said, just pay us whatever is just, they show that they're not working for mercenary purposes. They're working because they trust the landowner. In other words, they have a different motivation than the first guys. First guys, they work, pay me. The other ones that come afterwards, they say, hey, we'll work. We're not concerned about the payment. Are you with me? Now, let's go to the following section, working in the right spirit. With what spirit, here's the key. With what spirit should Christ's followers enter his service? Well, it's the Lord desires us to rest in him without a question. We should not say, okay, Jesus, I'm going to work for you. How much are you going to pay me? That would be mercenary motives. So the Lord desires us to rest in him without question. As to our measure of reward, when Christ abides in the soul, here is the key, the thought of reward is not what? Not uppermost. This is not the motive that actuates our service. So it's all a matter of motivation. What motivates you to serve Jesus? Is it because you want to win heaven and you want to shun hell? No. Those are mercenary motives. It's simply because we love Jesus and will work for him and we trust him to give us the reward that he determines to give by his mercy and by his generosity. Number 2, what should be our motivation for serving others in the name of Jesus? We should not be so anxious to gain the reward as to do what is right, irrespective of all gain. Love to God and to our fellow men should be our motive. So basically the idea in this parable is that we should work for God because we love God and we leave the reward idea to him. Number 3, what is more important than the amount of labor that we do for Christ? This is an important, do you know that Ellen White says that the quality of our work depends on the motive that prompts it? Let me ask you, is it true that some people do things with good motivation and things don't turn out too well? Yeah. Like, for example, I washed the dishes and I dropped one of my wife's favorite plates. I had a good motivation washing the dishes, but it kind of went south. Do people do good things with the wrong motivation? Oh, the Pharisees, yeah. Or the philanthropist that gives a bunch of money to build a hospital because he wants his name on it. See? So it works both ways. The key is the motivation. What motivates you to work? That determines the quality of your actions. So notice, number 3, not the amount of labor performed or its visible results, but the spirit in which the work is done makes it of value with God. So what motivates our works? That's the big question. Number 4, what is most important to God? The amount of work we do or our faithfulness in doing it? This is a beautiful statement. The smallest duty done in sincerity and self-forgetfulness is more pleasing to God than the greatest work when marred with self-seeking. Once again, it comes to what? Motive, right? Motive. He looks to see how much of the Spirit of Christ we cherish and how much of the likeness of Christ our work reveals. He regards more the love and faithfulness with which we work than the amount we do. What motivated Jesus to come to this world? Did he say, what's in it for me? No. Were we worthy to be rescued? No. Are you kidding? Not worthy at all. Sinners, rebels, alienated from God. And yet Jesus says to the Father, Father, I love those people. I'm going to go down there and I'm going to redeem them. And by the way, 3 times Ellen White says that Jesus went into the presence of his Father after Adam and Eve sinned. And he says, Father, let's implement the plan. And Ellen White says that it was difficult for the Father to give up his Son. Yeah. It wasn't, oh sure, go ahead. No. She says it was a struggle for the King of the universe to give up his Son. And so finally the third time the Father says, yeah. So Jesus goes out and he announces it to the angels. And the angels, they sing for joy. The fallen race is going to be redeemed. Not because they're worthy, but because Jesus loves them. Now it's interesting. It's different for Jesus to be seen what he was going to suffer from up there and have him suffering here. See, in 3 times in heaven he begged his Father if it was possible for him to come. When he was in Gethsemane, he begged his Father, if it's possible, 3 times he says, take the cup away from me. Because it's different to see it from up there. Intellectually, it's different to be going through it here. And yet he was willing to say goodbye to life forever to redeem us, not because we were worthy, but because of love. That was the motivation. All right. Number 5. What is the secret of success in laboring for Jesus? Not in our learning, not in our position, not in our numbers or entrusted talents, not in the will of man, is to be found the secret of success. Feeling our inefficiency, we are to contemplate Christ, and through him, who is the strength of all strength, the thought of all thought, the willing and obedient will gain victory after victory. Number 6, we're speaking about the remuneration factor. What was the spirit of the 11th hour workers, and how did they react when they were paid for a full day's work? Well, Ellen White explains, those who come into the vineyard at the 11th hour were thankful for an opportunity to work. Their hearts were full of gratitude to the one who had accepted them. And when at the close of the day, the householder paid them for a full day's work, they were greatly surprised. They knew that they had not earned such wages. The wages are what? An evidence of the generosity of the owner of the land. See, salvation is by generosity. They were greatly surprised. They knew they had not earned such wages, and the kindness expressed in the countenance of their employer filled them with joy. So you can imagine the countenance of the employer. He comes to them, he says, okay, here's your payment. Really? What do you suppose they said? Thank you! Right? What did the first laborer say? Cheapskate. So they had a different view of God, didn't they? Different view of God's character and different motivations for working. Number 7, how does God look upon those who serve him with self-caring motivations? There is nothing, listen to this, there is nothing more offensive to God than this narrow, self-caring spirit. He cannot work with any who manifest these attributes. They are insensible to the working of his Spirit. Powerful. Now, this particular parable has several applications. It has an individual application, which is the next section. It has a corporate application, It also has an application to the church age and a final application to the remnant church. So let's look at the individual application. That's speaking about each individual person and their individual motives for working for Christ. And there's only one question in this section. In the individual application of the parable, whom do the early hour workers represent? The first laborers of the parable represent those who, because of their services, claim preference above others. They take up their work in a self-congratulatory spirit and do not bring into it self-denial and sacrifice. They may have professed to serve God all their lives. See, this is in the individual application. I've been an Adventist all my life. How many of you have been Adventists for only 3 years? See, I'm going to tell the Lord He's got to give me more. You've only been Adventist 3 years. I've been an Adventist all my life. So don't I deserve more? I'm being sarcastic, by the way. They profess to serve God all their lives. They may have been foremost in enduring hardship, privation, and trial. And they therefore think themselves entitled to a large reward. The bottom line is they're not going to get any reward. Because God considers the value of our acts based on the motivations of those acts. Is a legalist going to be saved? Is a legalist who insists on being a legalist and is not converted, is a legalist going to be saved? No, because you cannot be saved by your own works. So in the judgment, what God is going to evaluate in the judgment is the motivation for our works. And that's why you have two kinds of believers. You have one kind of believer whose motivation is love. You have the other kind of believer whose motivation is reward. Now, let's take a look at the corporate application of the parable. In the corporate, that means larger, corporate application of the parable, whom do the early and latter workers represent? Well, you probably would have guessed it, but Ellen White explicitly tells us. The Jews had been first called into the Lord's vineyard. Remember we studied the parable of the vineyard? It has many similarities to this. And because of this, they were what? Proud and self-righteous. They said, we were called first. And we have worked for a long time for the Lord. Their long years of service, they regarded as entitling them to receive a larger reward than others. Nothing was more exasperating to them than an intimation that the Gentiles were to be admitted to equal privileges with themselves in the things of God. Have mercy, they said. How's that possible? Here we've served the Lord since we were called. In the times of Christ, they say, God called us and made a covenant with us 1,500 years ago. We've been serving Him all this time. And now these Gentiles, they come in now and they're going to get the same privileges as us. No, that doesn't work. Are you understanding what the central truth of this parable is? Number 2, were the first laborers faithful to their trust? In other words, was the Jewish nation, this is the corporate application, were they faithful to their trust? No. The husbandmen who had been placed in charge of the Lord's vineyard were untrue to their trust. The priests and teachers were not faithful instructors of the people. They did not keep before them the goodness and mercy of God and His claim to their love and service. Notice the leadership did not teach them that their motivation for serving God would be love. In fact, in the days of Christ, the leaders taught them rigorous casuistry where they had to perform all of these different duties to earn the favor of God. She continues, these husbandmen sought their own glory. They desired to appropriate the fruits of the vineyard. It was their study to attract attention and homage to themselves. Is that a danger that the church faces? Absolutely. Now, did the church in its early centuries face the same danger that the Jewish nation committed? Absolutely. Let's go to number 1. It's the only one that we have in the next section. The dangers in the church age of repeating this story of the workers of the vineyard, working for reward rather than working out of love. Was there also a danger that the church would follow in the footsteps of the Jewish nation? Ellen White answers, page 400, Christ's Object Lessons. Christ warned the disciples who had been first called to follow him, lest the same evil should be cherished among them. He saw that the weakness, the curse of the church, would be a spirit of self-righteousness. And the note is very important. It did not take long for the church to fall into the same trap as the Jewish nation had fallen into. Soon after the death of the apostles, the church lost its view of God's grace and entangled itself in a system of merits and demerits. You have to punish yourself. You have to go on pilgrimages. You have to light candles. You have to give money to the church. That's Roman Catholicism. People thought that they could earn their way to heaven. And that's the reason for the Protestant Reformation, isn't it? The reason for the Protestant Reformation is that the church had fallen into deep legalism. And so now Martin Luther comes up and he says, we're saved by grace through faith. He's trying to bring the church back to where it was at the beginning. Let's finish the note. Pilgrimages, indulgences, and penance came in as methods to purchase salvation. And even to this day, the Roman Catholic Church sells indulgences for the forgiveness of your sins. And they prescribe penance for you to receive absolution for your sins. Now, if that isn't trying to make some payment for you to be forgiven and accepted by God, I don't know what it is. So, did the church fall into the same trap? It did. And of course, the Protestant Reformation arose. And today, the problem is that we have the opposite. You know, we have people saying, oh, I'm saved by grace through faith. Well, it doesn't really matter how I live. So that's why Wesley arose and spoke about holiness and spoke about works. Because people misunderstood Luther. They said, see, Luther says that we're saved by grace through faith, and our life doesn't really matter. That's not what Luther taught, by the way. But that's the way he was misinterpreted. And so now people say, you know, we're saved by grace through faith, and so it doesn't really matter what we do. So the devil is an expert at taking the church to two extremes. Legalism or license. Faith or works. We're not saved by faith alone. We are not saved by works alone. We are not saved by faith plus works. We are saved by a faith that works. Because a faith that does not work isn't faith. Imagine God telling Noah, Noah, there's a flood coming. And Noah says, oh, thank you, Lord, for this great revelation. Noah, I want you to build a boat. Why should I build a boat? You know, you have power to deliver me. How did Noah show his faith? By building the boat. How did Abraham show his faith? He left Ur. How did Abraham show his faith at the end of his life? He took Isaac to sacrifice him. How did Moses show his faith? He could have been the Pharaoh. He said, no, I'm leaving Egypt with this rebellious people. Faith is an action word. It's not something that happens in your brain. It's something that happens in your heart that leads you to be obedient to God. That's true faith. A faith that works. Amen. Now, let's talk about the 11th hour workers What attitude should we have toward those who have joined God's ranks last? This is the fourth application, specifically to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, our church. In Christ's Object Lessons, page 402, what attitude should we have toward those who have joined God's ranks last? The first and the last are to be sharers in the great eternal reward, and the first should gladly welcome the last. He who grudges the reward to another forgets that he himself is saved by grace alone. The parable of the laborers rebukes all jealousy and suspicion. Another lesson of the parable. What solemn warning does the parable provide to the earlier hour workers? The parable is a warning to all laborers, however long their service, however abundant their labors, that without love to their brethren, without humility before God, they are nothing. There is no religion in the enthronement of self. So there's a lesson also for those who were called first, and a lesson for those who were called last as well. Now, number 4. Here's where we come to the end time, because this parable has a very important lesson in the end time. According to Ellen White, which period of human history is the 11th hour in this parable? She states, even at this 11th hour, present, there should be decided advancement made in the matter of a special preparatory work. In all our conferences, there should be well-organized plans for the instruction and training of those who desire to give themselves to the cause of God. So when is the 11th hour in the final application of the parable? Now. Now, Ellen White describes a mass exodus from the remnant church at the end of time. Who will fill the places left vacant by the unfaithful? Last Day Events, page 181. The broken ranks will be filled up by those represented by Christ as coming in the 11th hour. Who are those 11th hour workers? Who do you think they are? They're not of this fold. Let me read you. By the way, there's going to be a polarizing. Multitudes will leave the church, and multitudes will come in. Let me read you a couple of statements here from the Spirit of Prophecy. First of all, about the exodus of many from the church. Great Controversy 608. As the storm approaches, a large class, notice it's not an insignificant number, a large class who have professed faith in the third angel's message, but have not been sanctified through obedience to the truth, abandon their position and join the ranks of the opposition. By uniting with the world and partaking of its spirit, they have come to view matters nearly in the same light. And when the test is brought, they are prepared to choose the easy, popular side. Men of talent and pleasing address, and we're seeing those in the church these days, who once rejoiced in the truth, employ their powers to deceive and mislead souls. They become the bitterest enemies of their former brethren. When Sabbath keepers are brought before the courts to answer for their faith, these apostates are the most efficient agents of Satan to misrepresent and accuse them, and by false reports and insinuations to stir up the rulers against them. A large class will leave. Great Controversy 608. A large class will leave, but there's a beautiful truth, and that is that a large class will come. Amen. So the church will not suffer loss. Great Controversy 464. Interestingly enough, this is in the chapter titled Modern Revivals. She speaks about the counterfeit revivals, how that was just based on emotion and feeling and excitement, jumping in church and, shouting in the Lord and speaking in tongues and all these phenomena that are not based on the Bible, but upon your own personal experience. She speaks about a great false revival in the Christian churches at the end of time. But she also says that there will be a revival of primitive godliness such as never has been seen in the church since apostolic times. Let me read you that statement. Great Controversy 464. Notwithstanding the widespread declension of faith and piety, there are true followers of Christ in these churches. She's speaking about the Protestant churches, denominations. Before the final visitation of God's judgments upon the earth, there will be among the people of the Lord such a revival of primitive godliness as has not been witnessed since apostolic times. Are we longing for that time? Yes. The Spirit and power of God will be poured out upon His children. At that time, many will separate themselves from those churches in which the love of this world has supplanted love for God and His Word. Many, both of ministers and people, will gladly accept those great truths which God has caused to be proclaimed at this time to prepare a people for the Lord's second coming. These are individuals who did not grow up Adventists. Most of their lives they were not Adventists. They're coming at the 11th hour. She continues saying, the enemy of souls desires to hinder this work. And before the time for such a movement shall come, before the true revival, he will endeavor to prevent it by introducing a counterfeit. In those churches which he can bring under his deceptive power, he will make it appear that God's special blessing is poured out. There will be manifest what is thought to be a great religious interest. Multitudes will exalt that God is working marvelously for them, when the work is that of another spirit. Under a religious guise, Satan will seek to extend his influence over the Christian world. So there's going to be a polarization. Now, let's go to the next question, because this is related to what I just read. Ellen White describes these 11th hour workers in Volume 3 of Selected Messages 386 and 387. There are many souls to come out of the ranks of the world, out of the churches, even the Catholic Church, whose zeal will far exceed that of those who have stood in the rank and file to proclaim the truth heretofore. Interesting. For this reason, the 11th hour laborers, who are the 11th hour laborers in the final application? Protestants that come out of their churches, and even Catholics, she says, are the 11th hour workers. For this reason, the 11th hour laborers will receive their penny. She's referring to the parable, of course. These will see the battle coming and will give the trumpet a certain sound. Imagine that, ex-Roman Catholics giving the trumpet a certain sound. Whereas we have individuals in the church that are trying to put a mute on the trumpet. Yeah. Unbelievable. When the crisis is upon us, when the season of calamity shall come, notice this, they, that is the Protestants that come out, and Roman Catholics, they will come to the front, gird themselves with the whole armor of God, and exalt His law, adhere to the faith of Jesus, and maintain the cause of religious liberty, which reformers defended with toil, and for which they sacrificed their lives. Amen. Is that comforting? Yes. Do we have a message and mission for Roman Catholics and Protestants? We most certainly do. In fact, Ellen White says that when the loud cry is proclaimed, they will be surprised. They'll say, we didn't know that the church was Babylon. And they will respond to God's call. Come out of her, my people. And they will join in the proclamation of the loud cry. Number 7. Why did God call the Seventh-day Adventist Church? And what will happen if the Seventh-day Adventist organization proves unfaithful to her trust? You say, well, she never will, because she's been chosen and God can't reject what He's chosen. Whoa, be careful now. Now, don't get me wrong. This is God's remnant church. The church is not Babylon, as I've said. But to say the church will go through no matter what. No, God places conditions. And if the conditions are met, then the church fulfills God's purpose. If not, God will still fulfill His purpose. So what's going to happen? Why has the Seventh-day Adventist Church been called? And what will happen if the church does not fulfill its commission? Which, by the way, we're not doing a very good job of it now. 9 Testimonies, page 19. In a special sense, Seventh-day Adventists have been set in the world as watchmen and light bearers. What is a watchman? That is a defensive function. A watchman defends so the enemy doesn't come in. But we also have an offensive one, which is to be light bearers. So we defend and we shed light. To them has been entrusted the last warning for a perishing world. To whom has this been entrusted? To this little remnant church. God has entrusted this awesome responsibility of giving the last warning. The Adventist Church is the last hope for the world. And I know Jesus is the hope, but Jesus by using the instrumentality of the remnant church. She continues, on them is shining wonderful light from the Word of God. They have been given a work of the most solemn import. Import means importance. The proclamation of the first, second, and third angels' messages. There is no other work of so great importance. And now notice, they are to allow nothing else to absorb their attention. The most solemn truths ever entrusted to mortals have been given us to proclaim to the world. The proclamation of these truths is to be our work. The world is to be warned, and God's people are to be true to the trust committed to them. What is the only reason this church exists? To proclaim the three angels' messages. Do you know of any other denomination in the world who say that that is their mission? None. Only one church claims that the purpose for its call is to proclaim the three angels' messages to the world. And by the way, that includes political incorrectness. Because the first angel's message says, fear God, give glory to Him, the hour of His judgment is here, worship the Creator. But the second message says, in Babylon, that's not being done. So Babylon is fallen because she didn't accept the first angel's message. So get out. And the third message says, if you don't get out, the wrath of God will fall upon you. Because you will end up worshiping the beast, His image, and His mark if you stay in Babylon. You see the sequence? Now let's go to our final quotation. And I've read this one before. This is 8 Testimonies, page 247. In the balances of the sanctuary, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is to be weighed. She will be judged by the privileges and advantages that she has had. Has this church had huge privileges and advantages, folks? Just look at the medical system that God established in this church, the educational system, the publishing ministry, the prophet that He gave us that addresses every sphere of life, the organizational structure that God has given to this church, which has been the marvel of the world. God has given such blessings to it. It is rich and increased with goods. Amen. The problem is maybe it's saying in need of nothing. So she says she will be judged by the privileges and advantages that she has had. Now here's an if. If her spiritual experience does not correspond to the advantages that Christ at infinite cost has bestowed on her, if, once again, the if the blessings conferred have not qualified her to do the work entrusted to her. By the way, is this speaking of an individual or is this speaking about a church? It's the church. It's her. If the blessings conferred have not qualified her to do the work entrusted to her. And this is a solemn part of the quotation. On her will be pronounced the sentence, found wanting. Wow. By the light bestowed, the opportunities given, will she be judged. Does God have a right to require returns from this church? Of course He does. But we've gone down a detour. We detour on this road, the 2520. We detour down the anti-Trinitarian road, and we go down the Hebrew Feast road, and the Solar Calendar road, and we go the Flat Earth road, and very little is said about prophecy. We feel intimidated about reading Ellen White's quotations in our worship services. When God has given us all these privileges so that the world can really know what's happening and what is soon going to explode upon the scene in this world. Woe to us if we don't tell people. In love, yes. Because God's warnings, sometimes they're strong, but warnings are loving. If you tell your child, and I'm going to be graphic, if you tell your child, hey, if you cross the street without looking both ways, a bus is going to come and he's going to splatter you all over the road. Well, that's kind of mean, kind of graphic. Is that a message of love? Of course it is. You see, not only God's approvals should we hear, we should hear His warnings, because His warnings are given out of love, because He doesn't want us to go down the wrong road. Let's stay on the main road, folks. Let's not get off on all these side roads that have nothing to do with the final test. Let's fulfill the mission, the wonderful mission that God has given to this remnant church.